Airbnb is a startup that's based in Silicon Valley, and like many of the sharing economy startups, it managed to grow so big so fast by essentially skirting regulations. It was based on that premise of move fast and break things, and it wanted to work against regulations in order to grow as big as possible and win the popular vote, because it became so popular so fast that cities could no longer control it.
On a peak night this past August, we had 1 million people from around the world coming from 180 countries in a single night staying in an Airbnb home.
The vast majority of Airbnb stays, we're talking, 2 million people staying in an Airbnb on any given night, don't result in a safety incident. But sometimes things go wrong. And for the company, it was dealing with these cases was a really challenging, difficult, complicated area. You had hosts and guests, and sometimes they disagreed on what happened. You had regulatory issues in some of their biggest cities. Then you also had the growth of the platform and the fact that if you're going to try and prevent some of these incidents, it could cut into revenue and cut into the number of listings that you have. So for Airbnb, it was about trying to figure out the best way to handle these crises in a way that's going to not only protect the individual in crisis, but also protect the company's public image, its brand, its reputation, which is essentially what its business is based upon. As Airbnb grew, like way too big for them to be able to take all these calls alone, they developed a team of 100 highly specialized agents that handle the worst of the worst cases. Over the course of my reporting, I've talked to almost 50 former employees at Airbnb, and 7 or 8 of those work directly on this elite unit. These safety agents, many of them come from military backgrounds or trauma backgrounds. They're trained to handle traumatic situations and to try and, help people who are going through what may be, the worst day in their lives. For these safety agents, a lot of them understood that they had a dual role. First and foremost, they wanted to protect the user in crisis, but they also knew they had a responsibility to protect the company's brand and public image.
Everything about housing in New York is a total mess, and it's always chaotic. It's not too surprising that Airbnb's biggest battle has broken out here.
2015 was a really challenging year for Airbnb.
Airbnb's listings between 2010 and 2014 were essentially illegal hotels.
The company was 7 years old now. It had grown huge. It was now a household name. But by growing that big that fast, they also came up against, a pushback in regulations.
Now, Airbnb is under attack in a lot of major cities.
What are they saying about this?
They are, look, they can't give up on New York because New York's too important for every kind of reason.
They knew that they couldn't lose the battle in New York because it was one of their biggest markets, and also it could result in a domino effect. If other cities around America saw New York City either backing down on regulations or enforcing stricter regulations, that could in turn be rolled out right across the country. And in December of that year, a young woman from Australia flew into New York and stayed in an Airbnb with a group of her friends. They picked up a key from the local corner bodega without even needing identification. The police report said this 29-year-old woman left her friends at a midtown bar and returned to the Airbnb on her own. She thought that she was alone, but she wasn't. There was a man inside the apartment, hiding in the shadows, with a kitchen knife. He grabbed her, dragged her into a room, and raped her. He later fled. About an hour after this attack, he came back, and police were in the apartment at the time. They opened his backpack and found 3 items of interest: the kitchen knife, one of the woman's earrings, and a set of keys to the Airbnb. This case was a really complicated one for Airbnb, partly because it occurred in New York City, where they were fighting this really tough battle with city officials over regulations, and partly because the alleged rapist had the keys and he was inside the apartment. That meant that Airbnb needed to do what it could to protect itself. They wanted to find out, you know, how did he get the keys? That was a really big question for them. They launched an investigation to find that out. But before they did anything like that, before they thought to kind of protect their own reputation here, they really focused on doing what they could to help this young woman. They paid for her to move to a hotel. They paid for her mother to fly in from Australia. They paid for both of them to fly home. They offered to cover any health or counselling costs that she might need later. But inside the company, internally, they also launched an investigation. They wanted to know, how did the alleged rapist get the keys? How did he get inside that Airbnb? And when they found out that the keys had been left at the corner bodega, that then created, you know, a problem of liability for Airbnb. They didn't have a policy around key exchange. They didn't tell their hosts how they did or didn't have to hand keys over to guests as they were arriving. A week later, the alleged rapist was indicted in the Supreme Court in New York, and Airbnb sent a staff member to find out if the company was going to be mentioned in any of the court records. And it wasn't. It wasn't mentioned in the police report, it wasn't mentioned by prosecutors. There's no mention of Airbnb really in any public record. This case has never been reported until now. And, you know, 18 months later, when this woman's lawyer reached out to the company, they signed a settlement for $7 million. And part of that settlement, there's a clause that says she cannot assert or imply responsibility on the part of the company. We've spoken to legal experts who indicate that what this really did is gag the woman from saying, "I blame Airbnb." With Airbnb's terms of service, that really means that whenever there's a dispute between hosts and guests and the company, this is all handled behind closed doors in arbitration. Most of these cases don't even make it to the courtroom, and when they do, the company will settle them so it doesn't go on through the courts. And what that means is that there hasn't really been a legal precedent that's set to determine what Airbnb's liability is here. We often hear from the founders and the chief executive himself saying trust is their number one priority. I've actually heard Brian Chesky, the chief executive of Airbnb, talking about how he